Hi, I'm Don Gray. Welcome to Artist and Critic. Today we're going to take a look at, really I guess, to sum it up in a sentence, the effect of the 20th century on the modern artist. What are some of the problems that he's encountered, perhaps personally, and certainly in terms of society's effects, industrialization, and what has the 20th century done to the artist and their artwork. The first picture we're going to be looking at is probably quite familiar to you, and it's going to be Auguste Renoir's Moulin de la Galette, painted in the mid-1870s. And the basic feeling of the picture, of course, as in most of Renoir's pictures, is of pleasure-seeking, happy people, fulfilled people enjoying themselves in a life that seemingly doesn't offer stress, strain, or anxiety. Of course, anxiety is going to be one of the principal problems of the 20th century that all people will face, not just artists, and dehumanization as well. If we go to the next picture, we'll see some change taking place where, in contrast with Renoir's naturalness, the openness of the people, the friendliness of the people, we'll see in Georges Seurat's Afternoon on the island of Le Grand Jatte a painting where something has happened. Instead of the naturalness of the poses, the ease with which they deal with one another, arms around each other, the figures become stylized, they become somewhat static, and we begin to see the beginning of geometry creeping into painting, and with this creeping in, dehumanizing the figures to a certain extent. Now, this isn't to criticize Seurat. He's a powerful painter and a very effective painter, and certainly in this picture the figures assume a monumental form reminiscent of Piero della Francesca in the Renaissance. It's a beautiful structure, it's a beautiful painting, but while observing the Parisians in their afternoon activities, he also begins to solidify them, to dehumanize them to a certain extent, to geometricize them in a sense. If we go to the next picture, we'll see further evidence of the desire to escape from some of these incipient pressures that are beginning to come on. Late 19th century man. Here we're looking, of course, at a painting by Paul Gauguin entitled Day of God, where Gauguin, of course, goes to Tahiti and the Marquesas to escape the pressures and of everyday life in France. You know, the sense of dehumanization, the creeping sense of a crowd beginning to dominate the feeling of life, and the individual beginning to question his place, to doubt his worth in a sense. And Gauguin says, I want to go to Tahiti to find a place where I'm free to live, to love, and to paint. See, and to get away from the gradual enclosing vice-like grip of the approaching 20th century in the age of mechanization. Gauguin, of course, did not paint all his pictures in this formalized way. You know, he creates a religious picture with ritualistic significance, with the figures curled up in fetal positions in the foreground and certain offerings being brought to this idol. He was very naturalistic in his own way, very depicting the life of the Tahitians, but there is a certain stylization comes into his work, different from Seurat, but not unlike it in terms of the overall effect and the reason for its existence. Okay, we go to the next picture. And of course, this will be one of the leading figures of 19th century painting, and without him, 20th century painting would have taken a completely different source. And of course, we're talking about Paul Cézanne. And in his picture, The Great Bathers, we see again some of the stylization of the figure. We see them, of course, he's interested in structure. He's interested in structure almost more than the human figure itself. And in a sense, this has something in keeping, ties it in with the painting by Seurat. We think of Cézanne, people do today, as the progenitor of Cubism, all of the structural art movements in the 20th century. And certainly there's a great deal of structural emphasis in the great bathers, the triangle, the arch-like forms created by the tree trunks, and the placement of the figures where they tend to echo the base of the tree trunks and create sort of a U shape at the bottom through their arms, linking over a mysterious piece of cloth, or it seems almost to be a hole in the ground. There's a certain ritualistic significance about this picture. There's a certain emotional significance about the picture that I'm not exactly prepared to say what the meaning of the ritualized gestures are, but there's something going on in the foreground. There's something halfway in the river. Back there, a shape over which one figure protectively holds its hand, and across the river, there's a standing figure and seemingly a smaller figure or an animal. Of course, it has something to do with the development of personality, the stages of development of a being, whether in human terms or in spiritual terms. The far shore signifies, in a very direct symbol, the idea of going into the beyond, whether it be the future, into after death, or simply into mature personal development. Okay, we go to the next picture. And Cézanne, the reason there is emotional symbolical significance in that late Cézanne, despite the structural qualities of it, is that Cézanne was a very dynamic, very emotional character. In his early picture, here we're seeing the Temptation of St. Anthony. The figures are very solidly painted, very emotionally painted. They seem to come out of a sense of darkness. They deal with the theme of sexual lust, which tormented Cézanne over and over in his personal life and was evident in his early pictures. So that we find Cézanne's pictures, a result of his personal interior pressures and possibly the pressures of the century, as man, not being able to put his finger on it exactly, grows increasingly more troubled. And it might be said that Cézanne, in looking for this sense of structure in his pictures, is trying to compensate for this early emotional chaos, a certain growing chaos in the life of the society itself. Okay, why don't we go to the next picture, and let me guess what's up, and I'll do my damnedest as a seer of the invisible. Scheduled to come up here is a painting by Edvard Munch entitled The Dance of Life. And Munch is one of the major painters of the late 19th century and early 20th century, really lived to be into about 1940 or so, 1944. Life is not a cabaret for Munch. It is a struggle. It is an anxiety, tension-ridden existence. He had a lot of trouble, again, with women himself. And in this picture, the man in the center of the picture dances with a girl in red, while flanked on the left by a girl in white, and on the far right of the picture, which we aren't quite seeing, a girl in black, woman in black. And of course, it suggests some of the three stages of womanhood or humanity generally, but he's, before the days of women's liberation, he's seeing woman as the temptress, the vixen in the red, as a symbol of death and destruction in black, who will lead man into difficult areas of existence, to his own death perhaps, and white, assuming on the left a sense of the virginal, the pure, but implying more or less in this picture that she isn't really that, or if she is, she won't stay that way long. And of course, this is Munch's own attitude, and a Norwegian painter, influenced by some of Strindberg's feelings, the similar feelings toward women. We go to the next picture by Munch, and a very famous one, of course, well known, The Cry or The Scream. And this picture becomes a symbol of any of us at any time today who, feeling the pressures of life squeezing in, lonely, alienated, sensing that life, perhaps the meaning of it has drifted away from us perhaps a little bit, has become entangled in commercial values, political values, values that deal more with groups and mass movements rather than the individual, finally reaches a crescendo point of tension and simply just screams in hopelessness. And of course the whole environment with the twisting line reflects some of that feeling. Okay, let's go to the next picture, the far one on the right, please, Gene. And James Ensor is another painter who is particularly expressive of not only his personal trauma. See, the artist expresses himself, his personal agitations and fears and nightmares, but they become, if the artist is significant, the traumas of the society, either of that time or to come. If great art can often be prophetic, as I think we're probably all aware. And we see James Ensor's self-portrait surrounded by masks. And he sees society, of course, these represent society in its debauched state, in its loss of individuality, and there Ensor comes in the picture, rather self-possessed, but with a slight slant to the eye that says, oh my God, look at this, look where I am, I'm in deep trouble. And of course this expresses Ensor's problems as well as what will happen in the 20th century. Okay, if we pull the card and we go to the next series of pictures, we begin to see different reactions to the effects of the 20th century. In Picasso's Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, we've mentioned this briefly in a previous show, we see influenced by Cézanne and the angularity of it and the geometrization of it and African masks. Incidentally, going back to the primitive, as Gauguin sought to escape, Picasso uses primitive African masks to try to get down to some basic expressive feelings, perhaps feeling that life in the 20th century is becoming more mechanized and more meaningless, although this work itself seems to underscore the mechanization of the 20th century and some of its more deadly qualities. We go to the next one. And Marcel Duchamp's painting, Nude Descending the Staircase. No, we went one too far. Nude Descending the Staircase, which was exhibited in the Armory Show of 1913 and caused a furor. We have again the mechanization of the human figure, the disintegration of the human figure. And to me it's unfortunate that perhaps in our own time, if not at that time the artist wanted to express some of the problems of the new century. There was a certain joy really in some of the new forms that were created by machines, and there were artists who openly worshiped the machine and its product, the new forms, the smooth edges and the surfaces and so forth. But I think in our own time we're still living in the effects obviously of technology, but of art that has been is still worshiping the machine as if it had no ill effects, as if it didn't pollute, as if it didn't uproot whole vast masses of people, change their lives drastically. Yes, it gives us many benefits, but perhaps people are beginning to wonder just whether the deficits don't outweigh the problems. If we go to the next picture now, we continue to see the process of turning away from life, of going into one's own inner life in a sense, painting by De Chirico, the Italian, and called The Disquieting Muses, painted in the about 16, during the First World War. And people become monuments, the muses here that are people call upon to guide themselves through, foretell the future, guide themselves through the difficult times of the present, don't seem to be too responsive. Again, they become these ritualized figures. We can see connections with some of Seurat's figures in a sense, carried to a further, almost surrealistic extent. And they are indeed disquieting, the muses that control life at that stage of the 20th century. And we go to the next picture. It would be interesting to make up a balance sheet of the positive effects and the negative effects of the 20th century society, whether we talk about advances in medicine and also some of the defects of medicine, whether we talk about the advances in food and the defects in it, perhaps in terms of additives that are added to it and poisons and so forth. Betterment in agriculture with increased crops, but then we get it at the expense of poisoning the land and so forth. And when we begin to go into more and more of these aspects of the 20th century, and we take a look at de Chirico's picture here, the mystery and melancholy of a street, we begin to say that, yes, these artists are telling us something about, their own personal problems, but also the problems of our time, the sense of threat in this picture, the shadow, the mysterious shadow figure perhaps holding a staff, perhaps it's a separate shape, that loom around the corner of that dark building into the shadow and threaten the little innocent girl at the bottom of the picture with rolling the hoop. Filled with a sense of dread and a certain anguish and threat. Going to the next picture, at the upper right there, at the top right, Gene, if you would, please. To say nothing of war, some of the problems that have been caused by war, of mass societies, overpopulation, the sense of the threatening advance of technology and inhuman forces that really have engulfed us. We aren't the masters, I think, of the 20th century, at least not at this stage. And in Paul Klee's picture, March of the Aqueducts, there's a certain semi-humorous quality as these architectural forms with feet stamped forward toward us, but there's also this implied idea of threat that our machines and our forms are advancing on us, and we may die laughing, but we may end up under one of these falling aqueducts, that kind of thing. Okay, we'll go to the next one now. Thanks. This picture by Oskar Schlemmer, a German painter, 14 figures in an imaginary architectural setting, painted about 1930. Notice the similarity, the concept of the figures with those of Georges Seurat, whom we saw in Le Grand Jatte. Painted differently, but there's a stylized, statue-like, impersonal, immobilized quality to these figures. And who would, perhaps we read into it, but who would say that it doesn't suggest some of societal rigidity, if we want to put it that way, in the mass Nazi dictatorship that is about to overrun the country, where people will not be individuals, but will simply be allowed to live and function if they perform their cog-like functions in the German state. So that one almost seems to stand like a chess piece in the upper left-hand corner on a board with the squares out, waiting to be moved, not having any volition, any personality of its own to make the choice. Okay, we go to the next picture. We see a further mechanization, obviously, in this head by Rudolf Belling. Really kind of an interesting structure. A beautiful adaptation of machine forms by Belling. And I would never say that something like this shouldn't have been done, but my goodness, doesn't it tell us about some of the pressures and the effects of our time on the art. And frankly, when the pressures have reached such an extent as they have in our own time, to see work that perhaps is less creative than this, is less rich than that, is less diverse than that, becoming a dominant, being the dominant force in art, is to say that we've lost a certain amount of awareness of our own lives, awareness of our own destinies, awareness of our own needs. And if we look at this next sculpture coming up by Larry Bell, we see the ultimate continuation of this dehumanization, this depersonalization, and as we mentioned specifically in another program, the mechanization of art. And this is entitled Memories of Mike. And golly, I don't know, if I were Mike, I don't think I'd be too flattered to be remembered this way. And Mike seems to be a pretty square guy, you know. He didn't, his personality is somewhat rigid and limited. He's not too outgoing. He doesn't have too much to say, obviously. He just sort of sits there in this stiff structure that Larry Bell creates for us. I think it becomes a little bit ridiculous. We reach the point where the art doesn't make any sense. It doesn't mean anything beyond the narrow aesthetic qualities that an individual piece might have. And we can talk about the glass, and we can talk about relationship of rectangles and a certain fluctuation of color. There are certain yellows and pinks and blue-greens that have been fused into the glass that give it a certain colorful quality that you can't see on your screens. But really, is that enough? Can it be considered to be enough? And you know, we look at another head by Sophie Tauber, Art, and that really symbolizes some of our problems. It has a tape measure hanging on the outside of it, screws going to the side of the head, and we'll eventually get to it, I'm sure. But if we don't get to it, since we're running out of time, let's go to the last picture, because I'd rather we see the last picture here. Since we didn't get to Sophie Tauber Arp, we aren't missing that much with her, because it shows man in a state of disintegration. And I would suggest that Rembrandt, in this final self-portrait of his, let's take a look at Rembrandt. We see him laughing. Let's go back to the picture. And we see him in his laughing self-portrait. And we ask, what is he laughing at? What does he have to laugh at in the final hours and days of his life? And I would submit, friends, that he's laughing at the folly of life, that he's laughing at the silliness, the restrictedness, the meaninglessness of institutions that do more to restrict human life than they do to advance it. I think he's talking about the cosmic futility, in a sense, perhaps, of human life, but also he was a man, despite all the folly and the difficulties he encountered, who came out victorious in terms of creating a rich, significant body of work. And this final piece, it has a power and expressiveness that he goes out laughing, and he goes out with great power and conviction. And I think there's a message in this for us and for artists like Larry Bell to come back to a certain solidity and a feeling for expressive significance. Thanks very much. Have a good day. Bye-bye now.